The Basement Tenant, a novel, written by L.Z. Sinclaire, narrated by L.Z. Sinclaire. Chapter 7, The Pattern. Ava Ruiz had a system for the cases that mattered, and it started with the wall. Not a murder board. She hated that term, hated the Hollywood glamour of it, the suggestion that detective work was a montage set to moody music, rather than what it actually was, a woman in a bad office chair staring at paper until the paper started talking back. The wall was a corkboard in her apartment in Humboldt Park, behind the kitchen door, where no one could see it unless they opened the door all the way, which no one did because the door hit the refrigerator at 90 degrees and stopped. Margaret Osai's face was at the center. The photo was from the missing persons file, a formal portrait, the kind taken at a church directory session, with a blue backdrop and the careful lighting of a photographer who understood that dignity was a form of beauty. Ruiz had been looking at that face for 3 weeks. The case had come to her sideways, the way the interesting ones always did. She'd been working a string of property fraud complaints in Bronzeville, elderly homeowners reporting aggressive offers, threatening letters, men who showed up at doors with cash and contracts, and the particular smile of someone who understood that isolation was a vulnerability. The complaints were filed, logged, and shelved because property fraud in a gentrifying neighborhood was not a priority for a department that couldn't staff its homicide desk, and because the victims were old and black and lived in houses that the city's power structure had already decided would be better off in different hands. Ruiz's case was different because Margaret Osai was gone. Not dead, or not confirmed dead. Not moved to a nursing home, not relocated to family. Gone. Vanished from a house she'd owned for 31 years, leaving behind a car, a closet full of clothes, a refrigerator with food still in it, and a stack of mail that grew for 6 weeks before the postal carrier filed a report. The niece in Accra, Akosua, a school teacher with a voice that carried the specific grief of a person calling from 5,000 miles away, had given Ruiz the details in a phone call that lasted 47 minutes and cost more than Akosua could afford. Margaret called every Sunday, had called every Sunday for 22 years since Akosua's mother, Margaret's sister, died, and Margaret assumed the role of long-distance matriarch with the seriousness of a constitutional obligation. The call stopped in October. Akosua called Margaret's phone. No answer. Called the senior center. They hadn't seen her. Called the church. They hadn't seen her either. Akosua filed the missing persons report from Accra, and the report sat in a queue for 3 weeks before Ruiz pulled it, because Ruiz pulled every report that came from Bronzeville, out of a habit that was part professional and part personal. Humboldt Park and Bronzeville shared the same bones, the same history of displacement, the same knowledge that the city would forget you if you let it. She started with the house. But first, she went for a drive. It was something she did on cases that mattered. Put the address in her GPS and drive the route, feel the neighborhood, let the city's geography tell her things that databases couldn't. She took Ashland south from Humboldt Park, the route that Chicago's working class had been taking for 100 years, through Pilsen and Bridgeport and down into the South Side, where the grid opened up and the buildings changed from the tight, stacked flats of immigrant neighborhoods to the wider, more dignified structures of Bronzeville, which had been Black Chicago's capital before the expressway came through and cut it in half like a surgeon dividing a living organ. Bronzeville was in that specific stage of gentrification where the old and the new existed in uncomfortable proximity. A block of restored brownstones next to a block of boarded windows. A new coffee shop, exposed brick, pour over, the universal language of incoming money, across from a funeral home that had been there since 1952. Young white couples with strollers navigated the same sidewalks as elderly black women with grocery carts, and neither group acknowledged the other with anything more than the careful, practiced non-seeing of people who understood that the neighborhood's future belonged to one of them and its past belonged to the other. Margaret Osei had lived in this neighborhood for 31 years. She had survived the decline, the crime wave of the 90s, the slow recovery, and now the gentrification that would, if it continued, erase the very community that had made the neighborhood worth living in. She had survived all of it, and then she had disappeared. The brownstone on Prairie Avenue was handsome in the way that South Side brownstones were handsome, not the manicured, insured handsomeness of Lincoln Park, but the earned handsomeness of a building that had been maintained by people who couldn't afford to hire someone else to do it. The pointing was tight, the windows were clean, the front garden, small, fenced, showed evidence of recent care. Pruned bushes, a bird bath, a ceramic pot with the dried remains of marigolds. Margaret's car was in the garage, a 2015 Toyota Camry, beige, the odometer at 62,000 miles. The keys were on a hook inside the kitchen door, where a person who expected to come back would leave them. The inside of the house was what Riaz expected, and also what broke her heart, though she'd never have said that out loud and would have denied it if asked. The house was clean, the furniture was old but cared for, a couch with a crocheted blanket folded over the arm, a dining table set for one, a small television in the living room with a remote placed neatly on top. The kitchen had canned goods organized by type. The bathroom had medications in a row by the mirror, metoprolol for blood pressure, vitamin D, calcium. The bedroom was upstairs. The bed was made. A Bible on the nightstand, a bookmark at Psalm 27. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? No sign of forced entry, no sign of struggle, no note, no goodbye, just the absence of a woman from a house that was clearly, unmistakably still hers. Ruiz took photographs. She stood in Margaret's kitchen and looked at the canned goods and the single place setting and thought about her own apartment. The Jameson on the counter, the sink full of dishes she'd been ignoring, the bed she'd stopped making after the divorce, and she felt, not for the first time, the vertigo of standing inside someone else's careful life and knowing it had been interrupted. The sale was the thing that didn't fit. 3 weeks after Margaret vanished, before anyone in Chicago had filed a missing persons report, before coastless calls from Accra reached the right desk, the brownstone on Prairie Avenue was sold. The transaction was handled by a law firm called Gilman and Associates, acting under a power of attorney purportedly signed by Margaret Osei. The buyer was a Delaware LLC, Lakefront Redevelopment Partners. The price, $340,000. The county assessment, $520,000. Ruiz pulled the power of attorney document. It was notarized. The notary was a woman in Bridgeport named Patricia Holt, whose office was above a dry cleaner and whose client list, when Ruiz obtained it, included 14 other elderly homeowners on the South Side, all of whom had signed powers of attorney in the last 3 years, all of whom had subsequently sold their properties to LLCs connected to Lakefront Redevelopment Partners.
14 homeowners, 14 sales, 14 properties in neighborhoods that the city's development plan had marked for strategic investment, which was the municipal euphemism for gentrification, which was itself a euphemism for the organized displacement of people whose primary crime was living on land that had become valuable to someone else.
She'd worked a version of this 4 years ago. A 90-year-old man in Pilsen whose grandson had been pressured into signing a power of attorney by a developer who showed up with a six-pack and a contract. The grandson was 22, owed money to the kind of people who didn't send invoices, and the developer knew it. The old man lost his house. The developer flipped the building for $400,000 profit. Ruiz had investigated, compiled a file, and submitted it to the state's attorney, who had looked at it with the expression of a man reading a menu in a language he didn't speak, and said, "This is really more of a civil matter." A civil matter. An old man losing his home, a predator in a polo shirt with a clipboard. Civil. That case had died. Ruiz had swallowed the anger the way she swallowed the cheap precinct coffee, not because it went down easy, but because the alternative was spitting it in someone's face, and she needed her job more than she needed the satisfaction. This case was different. Margaret Osei hadn't been coerced, she'd been disappeared, and the scale was different. 14 properties meant organization. 14 properties meant infrastructure. 14 properties meant this wasn't a lone developer with a clipboard. This was a system. Of the 14, 3 were dead. Natural causes, all of them. Strokes, heart attacks, the ordinary failures of elderly bodies that no coroner would question. 6 had moved to nursing homes, to children's homes in other states, to the kind of managed care facilities that warehoused the old in the name of caring for them. 4 were unreachable. No current address, no phone, no digital trace. And 1, Margaret Osei, was missing. Ruiz laid it out on the corkboard. Photographs, property records, corporate filings. The LLCs were nested like Matryoshka dolls. Lakefront Redevelopment Partners, owned by Lakefront Property Services, owned by a holding company whose registered agent was a law firm in the loop. She pulled the law firm's client list through a subpoena she probably couldn't have gotten if the judge hadn't owed her a favor from a case 3 years ago. A case where Ruiz had found the judge's stolen car and had the grace not to mention where it was parked or who was in it. The client's list had one name that mattered: Weaver Development Group. Ruiz didn't know who the Weavers were. She wasn't from that world, the world of development firms and donor walls and aldermanic cocktail parties. She was from the world of double shifts and thin walls and the knowledge that the people who decided what happened to your neighborhood never lived in it. But she was a detective, and a detective's job was to learn worlds that weren't hers, to enter them the way a surgeon entered a body, with precision, with purpose, and with the understanding that what you found inside was often uglier than the surface suggested. She Googled Weaver Development Group. The website was polished, the aesthetic of a company that wanted you to know it was both powerful and progressive. Community investment, affordable housing. The face of the founder, Derek Weaver, attorney, developer, philanthropist. A handsome black man in a tailored suit, smiling in front of a building he'd renovated, with the mayor on one side and an alderman on the other. The alderman was Raymond Cross, Ward 20, Woodlawn.
Ruiz looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she looked at Margaret O'Sea's face on the corkboard. Then she looked at the Jameson bottle on her kitchen counter, which she had not opened in 4 days, which was a record, which was not something she was celebrating, because celebration implied she'd had a problem and she wasn't ready to admit that yet. She went to the window. Humboldt Park was outside, her park, the neighborhood she'd grown up in before it was a destination, when it was just a place where people lived because they could afford to and nowhere else. Her parents' house was 3 blocks away, sold in 2015 to a couple from Wicker Park who turned it into a single-family home with a rooftop deck and a kitchen island the size of Ruiz's dining table. She'd driven past it once after the renovation, and the house had looked back at her with the blank, renovated face of a building that no longer recognized the person who'd grown up inside it.
This was why the Margaret O'Sea case mattered. Not because Ruiz was sentimental. She'd burned through sentiment years ago, along with her marriage, her faith in the department, and her ability to drink socially. It mattered because she understood in her body what it meant to have your home taken. Not through violence, through the slower, legal, sanctioned process of displacement that the city called progress, and that the displaced called by its real name, which was theft, performed at a pace too gradual to photograph. She picked up her phone. She had a contact at the county recorder's office, a woman named Delia who had been there 30 years and who understood the filing system the way God understood creation, intimately, exhaustively, and with a growing sense of disappointment. "I need everything on Lakefront Redevelopment Partners," Ruiz said. "Every property they've touched, every filing, every name." How far back? 5 years. That's a lot of paper. I know, I'll bring coffee. Bring the good kind, not that precinct swill. Ruiz hung up. She drove to the recorder's office the next morning with 2 cups from Intelligentsia, $6 each, an absurd amount for coffee, the price of admission to a world she didn't live in, but whose currency she understood. Delia was in the basement. She was always in the basement, a small, meticulous woman in her 60s who had organized the filing system during the Koch administration and had maintained it through 3 subsequent administrations, 2 database migrations, and 1 flood that had destroyed the pre-1960 marriage records, and about which Delia still spoke with the controlled fury of a woman who took organizational systems personally. "Lakefront Redevelopment Partners," Delia said, pulling boxes. "I've seen this name before." "You have?" 2 years ago. A lawyer came in. Good suit, expensive shoes, the kind of man who thinks a filing office is beneath him but needs what's in it. He pulled every deed record for Bronzeville and Woodlawn going back 20 years. Spent 4 hours in this room. I offered to help. He declined. Delia set a box on the table with the reverence of a librarian handling a first edition. But I watched what he pulled. Because in my experience, a man in an expensive suit who wants to look at 20 years of deed transfers in the poorest neighborhoods in Chicago is either writing a dissertation or planning a crime. And he did not look like a graduate student. "Do you remember his name?" He signed the log. Delia opened a binder, the visitor log, handwritten because Delia trusted paper in a way she did not trust computers. She turned to a page from 2 years ago and pointed. Derek A. Weaver, Weaver Development Group. Ruiz looked at the signature, neat, confident, the handwriting of a man who was used to signing things, contracts, filings, documents that moved property from one set of hands to another. "Delia," Ruiz said, "you're a national treasure." I know. Now drink your coffee before it gets cold. I hate waste. She looked at the corkboard. 14 properties, one missing woman, a corporate structure designed to be opaque, and at the center of it, a name, Weaver, that meant nothing to her yet, but sat in her gut with the specific weight of something that was about to matter. She made herself dinner. Scrambled eggs, toast, the meal of a person who had given up on nutrition as a concept and was simply refueling. She ate standing at the counter, looking at the corkboard. Margaret's face looked back at her. "I see you," Ruiz said to the photograph. It was not something she would have said if anyone were listening, but that was the point of living alone. That was the price and the freedom of a life stripped down to its essentials, and the words felt necessary. A declaration, a promise to a woman she'd never met, from a woman who understood what it meant to be overlooked by a system that was supposed to see you. She washed the plate. She dried it. She put it away. These small domesticities, the plate in the rack, the fork in the drawer, with a scaffolding of a life that had, at various points, threatened to come apart entirely. The divorce, the disciplinary hearing, the Jameson, which had been less a bottle and more a relationship, with all the dependency and denial that implied. She'd pulled herself back from the edge, not through epiphany or therapy or the kind of redemptive breakthrough that movies promised, but through the mundane discipline of plates washed and dried and put away, of alarms set and honored, of cases worked with the stubborn, grinding persistence of a person who had nothing left but the work. She set her alarm for 5 a.m. She didn't open the Jameson. She fell asleep on the couch with the case file on her chest and the photograph of Margaret Osei looking up at her from the coffee table, patient as a woman who had learned that patience was the only power she had left. The end. You have been listening to The Basement Tenant, written by L.V. Sinclaire, narrated by L.Z. Sinclaire. Thank you for listening.